What started as a simple garden party turned into the moment. The royal mask slipped, and Princess Charlotte's quiet heartbreak shook the monarchy. It was meant to be nothing more than an elegant afternoon, gathering the kind of refined royal affair that had played out countless times before within these ancient walls. But sometimes, in the most unexpected moments, the carefully constructed facade of royal perfection can crack wide open, revealing truths that were never meant to see the light of day. Princess Charlotte stood among the guests that day, her small frame carrying herself with a composure that seemed almost otherworldly for a 9-year-old child. Those who knew her well often remarked on the haunting familiarity in her features, Diana's penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense, Kate's natural grace that made every movement appear effortless, and William's quiet strength that radiated even in stillness. She was, in every sense, the embodiment of 3 generations of royal women, each having faced their own battles within the gilded cage of monarchy. The afternoon proceeded with typical royal precision. Conversations flowed in measured tones, laughter emerged at appropriate intervals, and the ancient rituals of aristocratic gathering unfolded exactly as they had for centuries. Charlotte moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone born into this world, yet there was something different about her that day. A subtle tension in her shoulders, a wariness in those telling eyes that suggested she sensed something brewing beneath the surface. It was then that Eliza appeared, Camilla's granddaughter, moving through the garden party with the confidence of someone who believed herself untouchable. The words she spoke to Charlotte were delivered with surgical precision, not loud enough to draw attention from the adults, but sharp enough to cut deep into a child's heart. Those few witnesses who caught the exchange would later describe it as a masterclass in cruelty, disguised as innocent conversation. The kind of psychological warfare that can only be wielded by someone who understands exactly where to strike. Deemed Faithy. Transformation in Charlotte was immediate and devastating. The poise that had carried her through countless public appearances crumbled in an instant, replaced by the raw vulnerability of a child whose world had just shifted beneath her feet. Tears that she had likely been taught to suppress in public began to flow freely, and in a moment that would be seared into the memory of everyone present, she fled directly into Kate's protective embrace. The silence that followed was deafening. Palace staff, who had witnessed decades of royal drama, stood frozen in shock at what they had just observed. This wasn't the typical childhood squabble that might occur between young relatives. This was something far more sinister, a deliberate act of emotional violence that had struck at the very heart of the royal family's next generation. The implications hung heavy in the summer air, unspoken, but understood by all who witnessed it. But what nobody expected was how Prince William would react, and how that one moment would become the final straw. He didn't yell, he didn't storm, but when William walked across that garden, you could feel the entire monarchy shift. The moment Prince William's eyes found his daughter's tear-stained face pressed against Kate's shoulder, something fundamental changed in the air around Windsor Castle. Those who witnessed what happened next would later describe it as watching a man transform before their very eyes, not into rage, not into theatrics, but into something far more dangerous: calculated determination. William had been deep in conversation with King Charles, discussing matters of state with the casual ease that comes from a lifetime of royal duty. But when Charlotte's cry pierced through the polite chatter of the garden party, every word, every protocol, every diplomatic nicety evaporated in an instant. He excused himself with the kind of measured politeness that barely concealed the storm brewing beneath, his footsteps across the manicured lawn carrying the weight of a future king who had just watched his child's innocence be shattered. The approach was methodical, almost surgical in its precision. William didn't rush to Charlotte's side in a display of paternal emotion that might have provided gossip for the tabloids. Instead, he moved with the deliberate grace of someone who understood that his next actions would reverberate through the very foundations of the royal family. He knelt beside Kate and Charlotte, his voice so low that even the most attentive eavesdroppers couldn't catch his words. But his body language spoke volumes about the fury that was being held in check by sheer force of will. What followed was a masterclass in royal investigation. William didn't demand immediate answers. or create a scene that would have given the palace press corps their next headline. Instead, he began what could only be described as a quiet inquisition, speaking individually with staff members who had witnessed the exchange between Charlotte and Eliza. His questions were precise, his manner calm, but there was an underlying intensity that made it clear this was not a casual inquiry. Each conversation was brief, conducted away from the main gathering, and those who spoke with him emerged looking as though they had just participated in something far more significant than a simple fact-finding mission. The garden party continued around them, but anyone paying attention could sense the shift in dynamics. William returned to his conversations, smiled at appropriate moments, and fulfilled his royal obligations with the same practiced ease he had displayed all his life. Yet there was something different now, a coldness in his interactions with certain family members, a distance that hadn't existed an hour earlier. The silence wasn't avoidance or weakness. This was the silence of planning, of a man who understood that some battles required strategy rather than immediate confrontation. As the afternoon wound down and guests began their polite departures, William's demeanor remained unchanged. He bid farewell with the same diplomatic grace, thanked attendees for their presence, and played the role of gracious host until the very last car had departed through the castle gates. But those closest to him recognized the signs, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes seemed to be processing information rather than simply observing, the manner in which he held himself as though preparing for war rather than winding down from a social gathering. That evening, long after Charlotte had been tucked into bed and the castle had settled into its nighttime quiet, lights burned late in William's private offices. Senior aides were summoned for what was described as an urgent review of protocols, but those involved knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Royal event access lists were spread across antique tables. Guest approval procedures were dissected with forensic precision, and the very foundations of how family gatherings were managed came under intense scrutiny. By morning, a line had been drawn, and Camilla's family was on the wrong side of it. With one decision, Eliza disappeared from the royal landscape like she was never meant to be there. The machinery of the monarchy, when set in motion by a future king's absolute determination, operates with a precision that would make corporate boardrooms seem chaotic by comparison. What William orchestrated in those pre-dawn hours wasn't just administrative housekeeping, it was the systematic erasure of a person from the most exclusive circles of power on Earth. The orders were delivered with clinical efficiency through the palace's ancient chain of command. No heated phone calls to Camilla, no diplomatic discussions with King Charles. William simply informed the institution of his decision, and the institution responded with the kind of unwavering loyalty that has kept the monarchy intact for over 1,000 years. By the time the sun rose over London, Eliza's name was being quietly removed from guest lists that stretched months into the future. Her security clearances revoked with the same matter-of-fact precision used to update any other database. The scope of what vanished overnight was staggering in its thoroughness. Royal garden parties, state dinners, ceremonial events, charity galas, every occasion where Camilla's granddaughter had once enjoyed privileged access suddenly became off-limits. Her assigned seating arrangements at formal functions were deleted from protocol documents. The security detail that had once ensured her safe passage through royal events received new instructions that effectively rendered her invisible to their operations. Even her parking privileges at various royal residences, those small but significant markers of insider status, were quietly revoked. Palace staff, many of whom had witnessed the garden party incident firsthand, carried out these instructions with what could only be described as grim satisfaction. These were people who had spent their careers observing the delicate balance of royal family dynamics, who understood better than anyone the weight of protocol and the consequences of stepping outside acceptable boundaries. They had seen Charlotte's tears, witnessed the calculated cruelty that had been unleashed on a child, and now they were participating in what felt like long overdue justice. The swiftness of the action sent shockwaves through the royal family's extended network. Within hours, whispers began circulating among the aristocratic circles that orbit the monarchy like satellites around a star. Phone calls were made, discreet. Inquiries were launched, and slowly the realization began to dawn that William had not just made a statement, he had rewritten the rules of engagement for anyone who dared to target his children. What made the decision even more remarkable was its finality. There were no appeals processes, no diplomatic back channels through which Eliza's access might be restored. William had wielded his authority as heir to the throne with surgical precision, creating consequences that were both immediate and permanent. The message was unmistakable. Attacking Charlotte was not just unacceptable, it was unforgivable. The media, always hungry for royal drama, began picking up fragments of the story within 48 hours. Palace correspondents who had spent decades cultivating sources within the royal household started receiving cryptic tips about significant changes to guest protocols and revised security arrangements for family events. The more enterprising journalists began connecting dots, cross-referencing recent royal gatherings with sudden absences from upcoming events, and slowly the outline of what had happened began to emerge. The story that eventually broke wasn't just about one child's cruel treatment of another, it was about a future king drawing an unmistakable line in the sand. The public, still smarting from decades of watching the royal family navigate internal dramas with diplomatic restraint, found themselves witnessing something unprecedented: decisive action taken on behalf of a child's emotional well-being. And when the public learned what had happened, they didn't just agree, they erupted in support. Hashtags trended, tabloids roared, and suddenly, Eliza wasn't just a name. She was a national example. The digital wildfire that erupted when news of William's decisive action leaked to the press moved with the unstoppable force of a society hungry for justice, served cold. Within hours of the first headlines breaking, social media platforms became battlegrounds of moral outrage, protective fury, and unprecedented support for a royal family that had finally shown some backbone. The tabloid headlines screamed with the kind of dramatic flair that sells millions of copies. Future King lays down the law. William's war for Charlotte. And the royal reckoning. But these weren't just sensationalized stories designed to capture attention, they were reflecting a genuine groundswell of public sentiment that had been building for years. The British people, long frustrated with what they perceived as the royal family's tendency to handle internal conflicts with diplomatic kid gloves, suddenly found themselves witnessing a father who had chosen his child's well-being over institutional politics. The hashtags that began trending told the story of a nation united in unexpected ways. Team Charlotte became a rallying cry that transcended typical royal watchers, drawing support from parents, educators, child advocates, and ordinary citizens who saw something profoundly meaningful in William's actions. Real royalty emerged as a celebration of authentic leadership, with users sharing stories of their own experiences with childhood bullying and praising William for taking a stand that many wished their own parents had taken. Most devastating of all was Eliza Exposed, which began as a demand for accountability but quickly evolved into a broader conversation about privilege, responsibility, and the consequences of using power to harm others. What made this public uprising particularly explosive was the broader context that emerged as investigative journalists dug deeper into the story. The public discovered that Camilla's grandchildren had enjoyed what amounted to soft access to royal privileges for years, attending exclusive events, receiving security details, and basking in the reflected glory of their grandmother's position, without ever having to shoulder the corresponding responsibilities or scrutiny that came with true royal status. The revelation that these privileges had been extended without the kind of oversight that governed other royal family members struck many as fundamentally unfair. Traditional royalists, who might have been expected to defend the institution's handling of internal family matters, found themselves in the unusual position of applauding William's decisive action. These were people who had spent decades defending the monarchy's more controversial decisions, who understood the delicate balance required to maintain public support for an inherited system of government. Yet even they recognized that William had done something that strengthened rather than weakened the institution. He had demonstrated that the royal family was capable of holding its own members accountable when they crossed clearly defined lines. Perhaps most surprising was the support that emerged from typically apolitical voices, celebrities, athletes, business leaders, and public figures who rarely commented on royal family matters. They saw in William's response something that transcended the usual palace intrigue and touched on fundamental questions about how society should respond when children are deliberately harmed by those in positions of power. The story had evolved beyond a simple family dispute. and had become a symbol of what accountability looked like when it was applied fairly and decisively. The momentum building on social media began spilling over into traditional media coverage, with television talk shows, newspaper editorial pages, and radio call-in programs dedicating significant airtime to dissecting not just what had happened, but what it meant for the future of the monarchy. The consensus that emerged was striking in its clarity. William had not just protected his daughter, he had demonstrated the kind of leadership that the public had been hoping to see from the royal family for generations. But inside the palace, the applause felt more like betrayal for Camilla. Camilla didn't just lose face, she lost power. And she knew exactly who to blame. The walls of Clarence House had witnessed decades of royal drama, but nothing quite like the storm that unleashed itself behind those carefully guarded doors when the full scope of William's actions became clear. This wasn't just about her granddaughter being excluded from a few garden parties. This was about the systematic dismantling of privileges that Camilla had spent years carefully cultivating for her extended family. The Queen Consort's fury was volcanic in its intensity, erupting through the ornate corridors of her residence as she demanded answers from staff members who had never seen her lose composure so completely. Phone calls were made with the kind of sharp authority usually reserved for matters of state. But these conversations weren't about diplomatic protocols or charitable engagements. They were about power, access, and the sudden realization that the influence she thought she had secured for her bloodline had been swept away by a single decision from the heir to the throne. When diplomatic channels failed to provide the satisfaction she sought, Camilla took her case directly to the highest authority available to her. The confrontation with King Charles wasn't conducted in hushed tones or with the measured diplomacy that usually characterized their private discussions. This was a direct challenge to his authority, a demand that he override his eldest son's decision and restore the status quo that had allowed her family to enjoy royal privileges without royal responsibilities. The conversation that followed would be remembered by those who witnessed it as one of the most tense exchanges ever to occur within the royal household. But Charles, perhaps recognizing that his son had acted not just as a father, but as a future king protecting the institution itself, refused to intervene. The rejection wasn't delivered with cruelty, but with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation or appeal. In that moment, Camilla understood that the carefully constructed network of influence she had built over 2 decades as Charles's partner and eventual wife had limits that she had never before encountered. The fury that had initially been directed at William and the palace machinery that had executed his orders began to shift toward a different target. Kate, who had remained conspicuously silent throughout the public firestorm, became the focus of Camilla's increasingly bitter analysis of the situation. In conversations with her closest confidants, the Queen Consort painted a picture of calculated manipulation, suggesting that the Princess of Wales had orchestrated the entire affair to consolidate her own family's position within the royal hierarchy. Smiles in public, knives in private, became Camilla's bitter assessment of the woman she had once appeared to embrace as a daughter-in-law. The accusation was as damaging as it was unfair. Kate had done nothing more than comfort her distressed child and support her husband's decision to protect their daughter from future harm. But in Camilla's wounded perception, Kate's silence was not grace under pressure, but rather a strategic choice to let public opinion and media coverage do the talking while she maintained the appearance of innocent victimhood. The irony wasn't lost on palace insiders who had witnessed decades of royal family dynamics. Here was Camilla, who had once been portrayed as the calculating outsider who had patiently worked her way into the heart of the monarchy, now accusing Kate of the very strategic thinking that had characterized her own rise to power. The projection was stunning in its completeness, revealing a woman who had perhaps forgotten that her own position within the royal family had been secured through years of careful maneuvering rather than birthright or marriage ceremony. But Kate's response to these behind-the-scenes attacks was perhaps the most devastating of all. There was no response. No leaked counter-narratives, no defensive briefings to friendly journalists, no attempts to justify or explain William's actions. The Princess of Wales simply continued her royal duties with the same composed elegance that had made her one of the most popular members of the royal family, allowing her actions and her family's dignity to speak louder than any words could have. And while Camilla raged, Kate simply smiled, placed a hand on Charlotte's back, and moved forward. Without saying a word, Kate won the battle and redefined what royal strength looks like. As Camilla's anger surged behind palace walls, Kate Middleton's response was stunning. In its simplicity, she said absolutely nothing. No rebuttal interviews, no carefully crafted statements, no leaks from her circle. Just silence. But that silence spoke louder than any tabloid headline ever could. While Camilla was fuming over perceived betrayals and demanding her family's place at the royal table, Kate was already moving on calmly, gracefully, and with an unwavering focus on what truly mattered: her daughter. In the days following the ITD incident, Kate re-emerged into the public eye, not with defiance, but with quiet resilience. She attended a children's hospice charity event with Charlotte at her side, placing a soft hand on her daughter's back, offering comfort without theatrics. The photographs flooded the media. Not a single word was uttered about what had transpired, but the message was unmistakable. Kate wasn't playing to the gallery. She was simply being a mother, dignified, composed, and fully present. And that image alone eclipsed everything Camilla's camp tried to salvage. It didn't take long for the press to pick up the contrast. Where Camilla was seen lashing out behind closed doors, Kate was observed walking through hospital corridors, gently smiling at terminally ill children. While Camilla lobbied for her granddaughter's reinstatement, Kate was hosting early education roundtables and school visits. It wasn't performance, it was poise. And the difference wasn't lost on anyone. Even the most cynical royal commentators began drawing sharp lines between the two women. One was spiraling, the other standing still in the storm. Kate's refusal to engage became her loudest statement. While Camilla's allies whispered about manipulation and public sympathy tactics, Kate never once addressed the incident, not even indirectly. She didn't need to. The nation had already formed its opinion. Editorials praised her restraint. Social media dubbed her the Silent Queen. And through it all, Kate simply stayed the course. Her consistency, her calm, and her clarity turned what could have been a petty family feud into a defining moment of royal character. What made it even more powerful was that Kate never claimed victory. There were no triumphal gestures, no "I told you so" glances. Just a steady return to duty, to service, to her role as a mother and future queen consort. And that's what truly rattled Camilla, because for all the effort spent over decades reshaping her own public image, Camilla found herself utterly eclipsed by someone who didn't even try. Behind the palace walls, whispers grew louder. Staff noted the shift in loyalty. More aides were requesting transfers from Clarence House to Kensington Palace. Journalists who once cautiously tiptoed around Camilla's reputation were now devoting columns to Kate's effortless grace. The royal tide was turning not through confrontation, but through contrast. Camilla tried one last move, but the crown had already stopped listening. Camilla tried to claw back control, but found the door to power locked from the inside. In the wake of Eliza's quiet erasure from the royal spotlight, Camilla realized the power she once held was slipping fast. And this time, it wasn't just public opinion turning against her. It was the institution itself. For decades, she had walked a tightrope balancing between scandal and acceptance, surviving every headline, every whisper, every glare from the public eye. But now, the whispers weren't from outside the gates, they were echoing within palace walls. And for the first time since marrying into the crown, she felt the floor cracking beneath her. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, Camilla floated a calculated narrative. Stress, emotional strain, and whispers of health complications. Her advisors swiftly moved to draft sympathy-driven statements, testing the waters with a handful of trusted media outlets. But the public wasn't buying it. The reception was ice-cold. For every mention of her declining condition, social media was flooded with comments praising Kate's quiet strength and William's protective resolve. The press, once cautious and somewhat forgiving, had found a new storyline, one that didn't include Camilla. Inside the palace, the shift was even more brutal. Senior courtiers who had long aligned with Camilla's household, many of whom had helped craft her image rehabilitation over the years, began requesting transfers. The tide was turning, and everyone saw where the future lay. Kensington Palace was no longer just William and Kate's residence. It was becoming the gravitational center of the monarchy. And Camilla? She was being pulled out of orbit. But perhaps the most painful blow wasn't the loss of influence or the rejection of her narrative. It was the silence from the man she had built her legacy beside. Charles, ever the diplomat, refused to intervene. He did not publicly defend her. He didn't issue statements. When pressed privately, his response was muted, measured to the point of nothingness. "It's been handled," he reportedly said, barely looking up from his paper. To Camilla, it felt like abandonment. Years of weathering scandal together, and now, in the face of this quiet revolt, he had chosen neutrality. Whether it was wisdom or cowardice didn't matter to her, it felt like betrayal. And so, without any formal declaration or royal decree, Camilla's influence began to wither. No explosive fallout, no public humiliation, just a slow, suffocating fade. Her voice, once respected in private meetings, was now politely acknowledged and quietly dismissed. Her ideas, once forwarded to senior aides, were shelved without action. Even her presence at upcoming events became tentative and afterthought, in planning conversations that now revolved around Kate. What haunted her most wasn't that she was losing ground. It was how quickly it happened. Days, not months. One comment, one little girl's tears, one father's quiet rage. And now, everything she had built, the image, the position, the acceptance, was crumbling. She had spent years trying to prove she belonged. But now, the crown was moving on without her. And as Camilla's shadow faded, Charlotte became the unlikely symbol of a new royal order. She didn't ask for it. She didn't expect it. But Charlotte became the moment the monarchy changed forever. After the dust settled, Charlotte quietly returned to her everyday routine: school runs, family outings, piano lessons, and a shy smile at the occasional public event. But something had shifted, not just in the palace corridors, but in the public imagination. She was no longer just the cheeky, well-dressed princess waving from a carriage. She had become something far more powerful, an accidental icon of a monarchy, reshaping itself from within. All because she showed the world that even in the most gilded settings, cruelty still cuts deep, and dignity still matters. What moved people wasn't just her tears, it was what followed: the resilience, the grace, the unspoken strength in the way she carried herself afterward. The public didn't forget the image of her clutching her mother's waist, nor the way she held her head high the very next day. In that brief but heartbreaking moment, Charlotte stopped being a royal accessory and became a human face for a deeper truth. That behind all the pomp, the palace politics, the unspoken rules, there was a child just like any other who deserved to be protected. The response was seismic. Polls surged with overwhelming support for William's decision. Across newspapers, talk shows, and online platforms, people rallied around the Cambridges with a new sense of urgency. Suddenly, it wasn't just admiration, it was belief. The nation, even those often apathetic about the royals, had made up its mind. Kate and William weren't just next in line. They were the moral backbone of the institution. The future wasn't in crowns and titles, it was in values. And Charlotte had unwittingly become the first chapter in that future. The contrast could not have been sharper. While Camilla's world shrank with every silent snub, the spotlight on Charlotte expanded, but gently, respectfully. Not as a celebrity, but as a symbol. Not as a narrative pawn, but as a reminder. Her innocence, met with injustice, had triggered a wave of empathy strong enough to reshape royal perception. What once required decades of carefully curated image building had now happened in a single, heartbreaking afternoon. But the crown didn't fall on Charlotte's head, it hovered above her, waiting patiently, silently, knowing she'd grow into it on her own terms. Within royal circles, the phrase, "the Charlotte effect," began to circulate. It wasn't official, but it didn't need to be. Staff, advisors, and even distant branches of the family started to understand that the old rules were cracking. Merit was taking precedence over marriage, dignity over entitlement, and the public wasn't just watching anymore, they were measuring every move. But for William, it was never about symbols. It was about fatherhood, and what it truly means to be royal. William didn't just stand up for his daughter, he redefined what leadership in the royal family should look like. For decades, the British monarchy has operated on an unspoken hierarchy where titles meant power, and proximity often granted privilege. But William shattered that illusion with a single decisive act. When he revoked Eliza's ceremonial access, it wasn't just a punishment for a cruel comment, it was a signal flare for a new royal doctrine. According to palace insiders, this wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was deliberate, controlled. A statement with consequences designed not just for Eliza, but for anyone mistaking presence for entitlement. William wasn't just addressing a family dispute, he was setting a precedent. Behind closed doors, senior aides began calling it the Charlotte Standard, not a formal policy, but a new unwritten code. Access to the crown's inner circle would be based on conduct, not bloodlines. Behavior would outweigh association. Grace and humility would trump name and lineage. And this shift didn't come from Queen Elizabeth's generation, nor from Charles's reign. It came from the man who will one day sit on the throne, but acted first as a father. What resonated with the public wasn't just William's authority, it was his humanity. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't grandstand. He simply acted, quietly and without compromise. And in doing so, he earned the nation's respect, not as a royal, but as a man unwilling to let protocol come before his child's dignity. For years, he'd been cast as the steady hand, the heir who followed the rules while others broke them. But now, that steady hand had drawn an unshakable line, and the monarchy would never be the same. Meanwhile, Camilla's family disappeared from the royal narrative. No more photo ops, no ceremonial placements, no headlines. They faded, quietly, and almost completely. What once had been carefully staged moments of inclusion were now footnotes in a royal era that had closed without notice. The message was unmistakable. Symbolic access was not legacy, and legacy had to be earned. It was a painful realization for those on the margins, but a necessary one for an institution redefining its values under the weight of public scrutiny and generational change. The crown, once seen as an immovable relic of tradition, was subtly evolving. Merit began replacing formality. Discipline overtook appearances. Emotional strength, not detachment, became the mark of a true royal. And at the center of this transformation was William, standing firm not just as the future king, but as a man who understood that protecting one's family and setting principled boundaries were no longer just personal decisions, they were institutional. Once in defending his daughter, William didn't just protect a child, he protected the crown's future. And the world took notice. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.